All right, motions for the grand finals.
You know, can you move here so we can look at you? Snapchat. Stay good.
Here.
No. New debate. It's just fair. New debate.
Motion. This House believes that faith states should be governed by the way of international trusteeship, composed of regional and neighbouring states. On this note, I invite the Prime Minister to the open finals of ASDC 2017.
The life of the stateless is one that is dependent on time. In this scenario, we have a ticking time bomb, and from that, we see that the principle of action then arises. We see that in these states rely on a system that systematically oppresses the weak. The militia can enforce their will with their AK-47s, and the government has little to no power to stop it. This government can barely even provide the most basic and necessary provisions to ensure that these people can live until the very next day. On this, what's our policy? We plan to create a UN ad hoc committee with similar states around that country, and we're going to consider things like, for example, similarities in culture. We're going to consider their capability to actually be part of the state. We're going to consider any historical conflicts that may accrue. That means to say, in the context of Jordan, Israel isn't going to be allowed to be part of that committee, right? This council will have equal votes on policy, and we're going to make sure that it has the propensity to make snap votes on things that can happen really quickly. We're not going to allow any vetoes as to ensure expediency. Afterwards, we're going to require a certain number of donations, and we tell you that it's not going to be too much of a strain because this is a committee made up of different bodies. We're going to have a different UN body to decide the length of this control, and we're going to make sure that other types of aid from the UN, from the EU, can be properly distributed by these types of states. Okay, on this, let me move on to my first argument. But
Sir,
before that, sure.
will you establish democracy in these states?
Yes, we will. But we tell you that if the only argument that you're going to bring to us is undemocratic because they're not going to be represented, your right to sovereignty only exists when there is a state to enforce that sovereignty. Therefore, that's not something that we buy. So, how is this effective then in rebuilding the state? First of all, I'm going to argue this on 3 levels and on 3 steps. The first level, we're going to tell you that you fill in the immediate power vacuum since this is something that's going to be planned, this is something that's going to be ready. What's the problem and why is this so important? Because a lot of times when stable governments aren't present, militia groups, rebels, and terrorists therefore seize the opportunity to start enforcing their will on their people to try and seize power. We see this in places like, for example, Iraq and Afghanistan, where the power vacuums were left caused a constant rise of terrorist groups like, for example, the Taliban and ISIS. Second level, we're going to keep general society running because we see that the problem within these states and the reason why they can't function as normal states is because we see that the most basic of things, like for example, the police, utilities, business, and schools are something that the state cannot provide to its individuals and cannot survive on its own. When we allow these things, create this policy and it passes, what happens is we're going to allow them to enforce the police. We're going to make sure that they can enforce utilities, and we're going to make sure that business, schools, and other basic infrastructure like hospitals are things that are present. That means to say that we're going to do our best to make sure that a reasonable and average society can exist within these societies. That means to say that you can live as an individual comfortably within the society with fear and without fear of terrorists and with help from the states. Hello, Brother Brady, right? Okay, third level, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that afterwards, these states have a stake in making sure that there's going to be full rehabilitation coming from the states. That means when the most basic of needs return, when it's not something as that urgent, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that things like, for example, development aid, humanitarian aid are things that are properly distributed by these people. That means to say that if you're proposing that we just give aid directly, we tell you that it's never going to be effective because they don't have the ability to properly distribute these types of resources. That means to say that if you're going to tell us that, oh, we're going to give them aid, it's never going to work unless you give you appoint a body who has the propensity to properly distribute these things. How else can we ensure full rehabilitation aside from the development aid that we provide? We're going to make sure that it opens up its trade and it opens up the market for people to return to jobs. That means to say that it's going to make sure that corporations still do exist within these countries. It's going to make sure that you can go to school and have an average quality of life afterwards. We're going to make sure that in these places you can study to be a doctor and these types of jobs can still exist at the end of the day. So what's the conclusion of this argument? It's going to be effective simply because you allow the most basic qualities of life to exist and a society to flourish. But what then is the comparative? Because on their side, what happens in status quo is that what happens on their side when you allow the UN to constantly make decisions with a UN started government. What happens is that international politics that affects the type of things that happens within the state. That means to say that there's going to be a large amount of delays. How do we say this? We tell you that the mere fact that Russia and and other states that are part of the Security Council can veto on the type of aid that you're getting, can veto things like, for example, the type of action on trade that you're getting is something that proves that you're going to have a delay and doesn't directly respond to this urgency. This debate isn't just about how we develop the state. It's about how we develop the state right now, responding to the urgency that we have. Right? We tell you that it's plain and simply going to be faster on our side because you're not going to allow any vetoes and votes can have the action happen the very next day. Okay. Now to move on to my second argument on the principle justification. That I've already told you that the principle already exists with the mere fact that there is an urgency and we need to act. But then, let's talk about sovereignty and why is it justified for different states to breach this type of sovereignty. We tell you that this sovereignty never existed at the very get-go and never existed within this type of scenario. Why do we say this? We tell you that you only exist and the propensity for your state to be able to provide your will through things like, for example, elections, democracy, only exists when there's a state that's capable enough to provide these type of things. That means that in this government, we tell you that this type of thing never existed. This is a failed state, and this is something that we see can never be entrusted into the hands of the militia, right? How do we say this? We tell you there's a failing government with little to no power, and therefore they can't enforce these type of things. Where's the precedence, right? We tell you that the mere fact that we were able to invade Iraq and forcibly implore policy because of the fact that we conceded that the sovereignty stopped when their ability to actually enforce the will of the people stopped as well. So the main reason why government has to take this debate is because this is something that happens now. We're responding to an urgency that's happening now, and we're not going to wait until all of the children starve before we realize that the vetoes are doing nothing. I'm very proud of folks.
Thank you very much for that speech. I invite the leader of opposition.
Here. Do we have a mic to hear?
Hello.
Thank you.
Hello.
Ladies and gentlemen, a state wherein its sovereignty is forced down its throats by neighboring states is not a state in its truest form. Two standards for today's debate. Firstly, where does the right to govern lie? But secondly, what is best for these failed states in the long run? And I'm going to have two arguments for that. Firstly, on why the right to govern should lie with these states and these states alone. And secondly, on how we're best able to heal failed states under our side. But before that, what is the clash offered by silent opposition? What are we going to do on opposition? We're going to establish a democratically elected government, but we're perfectly willing to have things like, for example, international aid, developmental aid, to make sure that we can have strong democratic institutions and hold free and fair elections under our side. Second, we're also perfectly fine with, for example, the Human Rights Commission, for example, having international monitors to make sure that that state does not have human rights violations. We're perfectly fine with that. But we think that the inherent characterization on our side is that we're able to establish a democratically elected government that can govern itself and has all the power to determine its decisions. Because what exactly do we think the international community on our side is bound by? It's bound by, for example, international conventions, like the Geneva Convention. It's bound by the ICJ and the ICC. It's bound by, for example, the Democratic Peace Treaty, which is to say that you are less likely to start up conflicts with democratic states in the long run. Before I move on to my arguments, first a few levels of rebuttal. The first thing I want to point out is the contradiction coming from Prime Minister. Why? He told us that under their side, they don't want the UNSC to intervene because they think that Russia will be able to veto these things anyway. But on their side, they're still okay with things like, for example, UN aid and development aid. So that means that on their side, they're not able to get those things anyway in the long run. Next, most of his argumentation relied on this idea that, oh, the state is failing right now, and if we're able to provide them human rights through these regional powers, then that's a value in and of itself. The problem with that argumentation is that it wasn't mutually exclusive. He never provided to us any analysis as to why exactly they can only get human rights through a regional power when we can provide that with a democratically elected government. He provided no mutually exclusive analysis. Next, I just want to point out that the examples he gave, Iraq and Afghanistan, the reason why they're failed states is because of external intervention. We talked about, for example, Operation Desert Storm, for example, the Second Gulf War. These states screwed up because of international recognition, not because their own governments screwed up. Please read up. That's not the first argument about why exactly we think that the right to govern should lie with these states. The first reason is very simple. Because we think that the reason why these states have failed in the first place is because they weren't able to recognize the will of their people. That's why we give states sovereignty to begin with. But then we think that when you take that sovereignty and hand it to another regional state, then you're basically replacing it with another state that cannot exercise sovereignty as well because they're not able to follow the will of the people either way, because you're putting it under not these people, but rather you're putting it under a regional power. So then what you do on your side is you rob these states of sovereignty and you make it so that they're only under the will of these other states and not the will of the people. But second, we also think it's important for these states themselves to be able to determine their own path to development. For example, we talked about, for example, Iraq, Iraq that had their post-conflict society determined by the US. We talked about, for example, the IMF dictating sanctions to Argentina, causing it to fall into economic crash. We think that these states should be able to determine the best way for themselves to develop instead of these international bodies being able to intervene, because we recognize that these states have different cultures and different ideas for social economic development, and we want to recognize and accommodate all of those. But we think that thirdly, also, historically, it's because of these neighboring and regional states that these states are failed states to begin with. We talked about, for example, the DRC, that's screwed up because of the Rwandan genocide. We talked about, for example, Kuwait in Iraq. We talked about, for example, Syria, that is screwing up because of regional intervention for Iran and Saudi Arabia. We think that these states on our side were, if they were not selfish and inherent and intrinsically hostile, they were negligent. We talked about, for example, the Battle of Mogadishu, where Afghanistan screwed up simply because the UN decided to pull out. We talked about, for example, not intervening in the Rwandan genocide. So why are you on your side? Are you granting the very states that caused the failure of these states to convert them? Before I move on, yes.
You have to recognize that examples like Iraq and these other places that we did, the reason why we failed is because we installed democracy and we left them prematurely without people to enforce their own law. And we won't leave them prematurely.
Because we think that sovereignty is important to make sure that in the long term we're able to get a purely democratic state under our side. Why? Because on your side, what we think is that these states will never truly be free from the whole of these regional states. Why? We talked about, for example, this is the reason we think, because we think that the reason why states are able to, democracy is able to be appreciated in the long run is because those people are able to have a stake in that democracy, have a stake in the creation of that state. No, thank you. That's why, for example, people still contest the EDSA revolution right now, because they say that it's a revolution only created by the elites, only created by Manila and international bodies. We think that if we want to have a government that is respected by the people, then we think that it should be hands of the people themselves. What is the controversial? Thank you on our side. What we're able to do on our side, we're able to establish a government that follows the will of the people. Second is in line with their cultural interests. And third is willing to compromise with the different states within that state on their side. They don't have a democracy. They're not able to do those things. Let's move on to the second argument about how on our side, thank you, we're able to heal these failed states. And on your side, you can't do that. Firstly, we talked about the probability of proxy wars on your side. Why do you think proxy wars are likely on your side? Firstly, we talked about, for example, deep ethnic tensions that are drawn in these places. For example, Sunni and Shia in the Middle East. For example, Neighbouring in South Sudan, or the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. We think it's therefore likely, for example, for these other states that also have these ethnic tensions to prop up ethnic tensions in these states and have their proxy wars. Because we recognize it's not just one state governing these places, it's multiple states. But secondly, we also talked about the regional dynamics. So even if they don't have a history of intervening in these states, at least they have international power, a regional power play, like for example, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and you allow those things to interfere with the creation of your state. But secondly, we also talked about the formation of selfish interests within these states. We talked about, for example, Rwanda by Zimbabwe and Uganda is the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. We think that these states have a mandate firstly to their people, provide economic prosperity to them before economic prosperity to these states. What is their incentive to help? And if on the converse, we're able to provide a government that is both accountable to the people, but secondly, also allows for the participation of that people, for people that is able to feel that they can participate in a democracy that they themselves will not revolt against. We think on our side, we're able to best give the power back to the people, give the power to that true country. And on our side, we're extremely proud to oppose.
I invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hit the mic.
Wait, it was never going to be a contested issue in this debate, whether or not you actually want to fulfill the interests of the people within these countries. The question of this debate is how can we best fulfill their interests and how can we best create a stable state? The thing that government, the opposition side wants to push through is that they want to have a democratic state to fulfill the will of the people without actually analyzing whether a democratic state can actually exist, like they said, in a world where ethnic violence and conflict already plague within these countries and these states don't have the capability to actually enforce these on their own. When we raised it in the POI and asked how they're actually going to make sure that they won't leave these states prematurely like they did in Iraq and Afghanistan, there only response was, well, we won't. But they failed to recognize that the reason why these states left prematurely is because their facilities weren't capable of actually defending things like democracy. If you actually have some kind of analysis on things that are necessary for fulfilling these states which have high conflict scenarios, you're going to need things like huge military interventions, huge amounts of economic access, which are not going to be capable or accessible to a recently failed state, which is only receiving developmental or humanitarian aid. In fact, the only way you can actually achieve this goal is to have a foreign military be and regulate within your country, to be the police force within your country, which isn't exactly the idea of sovereignty, because what you're essentially trying to do is hand off the majority of power within your country to another country just so that your country can stay afloat. Sure.
Sir, post-Civil War, the US was able to maintain its democracy because it still bought into it, rather than ceding its sovereignty to countries like Britain and France. It's possible.
The post-Civil War happened 200 years ago between two countries that were necessarily the same. The conflict wasn't about race violence or religion. The conflict was about policy, about whether or not they wanted slavery. We start doing conflict scenarios such as this, when the conflict goes so deep, about 1,000 years to decide who was the legitimate heir to Muhammad. We tell you that the way to do it is not just to fulfill your own interests, but to give a governing body who has the capability to actually enforce the interests of the international community to actually do it better. And to add another level of analysis to the Prime Minister's argument about why it's better for these states, we tell you that you can't just lead into a democracy or the aid, because states that are neighbors have the capability to mobilize their own workforce from nearby countries to actually come in and they intervene immediately right after this kind of conflict to be resolved. First of all, some formal rebuttals. The first thing that they tried to say to us was that, look, what you're inherently doing is you're making a state that's fundamentally illegitimate. They said that because if these states don't try to represent their own people, the people within these states aren't ever going to see the state as legitimate, and therefore it's a harm. First of all, we don't see this as mutually exclusive. For example, if we were to intervene in, say, Syria, where there's a large, where the disparity between Shiites and Sunnis is very low, and you have a democratic process, and the slight majority of the democracy actually goes to, let's say, Sunni Muslims, then the Shiite minority is never actually going to respect or ever actually going to accept the kind of demands that a Sunni-backed government would ever have. We tell you that the only way we can have a government, there will never be a government that will be fully accepted by the people until stability can ensure. The only way that we can actually fulfill these people's interests is to actually make sure that we, let's say, have the capability to enforce things like law and order. Second level of rebuttal, when they told us that countries would interfere within these states and therefore try to pursue their own personal interests. For example, if one state wanted to pursue the dominance of one particular ethnic group. We've already discussed that in our policy, we're not going to allow countries with particular conflicts or particular conflicts of interest within these countries to actually rule these governments in the first place. But assuming that this is true, we still tell you that it's not going to work. Because just because one country's interest wants to forward this, we tell you that other countries aren't going to have the same interest and are going to be doing it. But we tell you that even if it's an act of ambiguity, there's actually an active incentive for them not to accept the whims of one country to destabilize it. Because we tell you that if you're neighboring a country and then that country suddenly becomes again a failed state where terrorism and civil war comes free, it's an active conflict of interest for you to want that state, meaning that it's in your personal interest to want the best possible state possible. And then let me move on to my two constructives. I'm going to tell you two constructives here. Firstly, I'm going to tell you how in the long run, you're going to have the capability to, let's say, ensure stability within the region and make sure in the short term and long term, we can ensure this kind of peace. How am I going to argue this to you? We tell you that the reason why the majority of states, let's say, fail or have a cycle of violence is because of things like extremism. We tell you that when people are hungry and desperate, they tend to do hungry and desperate things. And we tell you that when they do this, they're gonna actively harm things like, let's say they're gonna destroy a water treatment plant, or they're gonna bomb cities, things like terrorism. We tell you that this actively perpetuates the problem, where you put more people into this desperate, harmful situation, which just creates a snowball effect of violence and extremism at the end of the day. We tell you that one thing that's very necessary is to immediately stop this kind of cycle of violence and extremism from taking over the country as a whole. We tell you that the only way to do this is strong, fast action from a particular entity that has the capability to enforce its will over the country.
The only particular entity that we can actually trust here is the entities that surround this country because they have the capability to, let's say, enforce military access, they enforce military usage, or to declare certain laws to make sure that they can ensure this law and order and suppress these kinds of people, and to, let's say, feed the people before they, let's say, become even more desperate and they become extreme and be like opt into things like militia because that's the only reason, that's the only way that they can feed themselves, right? Meaning that the first necessity to ensuring the stability of the state is to make sure that things like extremism and things like the creation of violence is something that's stopped. But secondly, we tell you that in the long term, to make sure that these states remain stable past the post-conflict world, when we already see that they're developed enough to be on their own, the only way that we can make sure that these ethnic tensions don't spring up again is if we make sure that this cycle of terror, like this cycle of extremism, doesn't happen by making sure that the relations between the countries surrounding them are very good. So we can ensure things like free trade policies to make sure that the standard of living, the capability for these people to live without a life of extremism is something that can be survived and something that can be capable throughout the era. Secondly, argument that I'm going to tell you is about things like turnovers. We tell you that if you just give a government, let's say, okay, you're a democracy, go figure it out, we'll give you some aid, that's not going to be a kind of effective democracy. Why? Because we tell you, like you said, that democracy in form of government has no legitimacy, and the legitimacy that was formed by it was only supported by the initial army that institutionalized that kind of government in the first place. Meaning that government doesn't have the capability to enforce laws because nobody will listen to them. We tell you that if a long-term process happens, when we can already ensure these kinds of things immediately, and then we can have a strong hand, make sure that, let's say, that we already have like the prerequisite to the state already there, just waiting for it to be like, just waiting for us to pull out, for it to take over, that the state is going to have a greater capability to control its population. Why? Because when the state, or when you transfer all of these kinds of precedents and institutions such as the water supply and all of these economic processes to this new state now has the capability to, let's say, use your arms to coerce people to follow the state, or to make sure that the state can still stand even if without its international support and without its surrounding support, something that you won't get on opposition side because you simply leave these states alone without the capability to use things that only the surrounding community can provide. With that, I'm proud to propose.
I invited Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi. What government failed to realize is the spectrum of not being a failed state is pretty darn huge. You can be pretty close to being a failed state and not be considered a failed state, and you can be a developed nation. We say by making it so that foreign nations, specifically your neighbors and regional powers, ruling you and taking your sovereignty, you will give them an incentive to only give you the bare minimum quantities. We think that as a result, what you're essentially doing is making it harder for the state to develop, harder for the state to transition into a fair, clean and fair democracy, and harder for the state to essentially have fair regional ties which are representative of its own people's interests. What we essentially want is a state where these people determine their own policy with the help of UN peacekeepers. What this previous speaker essentially argued was that we cannot have fair and we cannot have peacekeeping because nobody else will. Clearly they didn't listen to what Stephen said. Stephen said that we can have UN peacekeepers as well who enforce safety, who enforce public order, and make it so that the sectarian divide isn't as clear. We can do that, and we can make it so that this type of stability will accrue on our side as well. What am I going to argue in today's debate? I'm essentially going to argue how you can transition to a fairer and cleaner democracy, both internally and externally, by making these people self-determined. We think
that you can only do that on our side. It's an exclusive argument. But before that, a few rebuttals to the entire government bench. What essentially they said from Prime Minister was that sovereignty didn't exist in the past. Their standard, notice, of sovereignty was elections and democracies. They said that sovereignty was a value. So, if you want sovereignty, then shouldn't you hold elections and democracies with the protection of the UN and with the safekeeping of the UN? Sovereignty must exist. Then they said that they will mobilize a workforce from the regional powers. We say, why won't the regional powers also invest in a booming economy on our side? There's investment opportunity in the new state. There's new systems that they can invest in. Mobilization of workforce isn't exclusive on their side. Then they said that there's a conflict of interest because neighbors will veto. Notice, that's a contradiction with what the first speaker said. Because first, initially, he said they won't allow vetoes. But then, the second speaker came up and said you can veto because, well, some conflicts can't be resolved. That means that the conflict of interest will not be resolved on their side because they're allowing a proxy war to persist. Again, a listening problem. They did not hear Stephen. Fourth rebuttal. Then they said that there will be turnovers. They said that the turnovers will be clean because, like, essentially, like, you will uphold, like, the will of the people later on. We can also have the upholding of the will of the people on our side. Arguments. Why do you think it's more probable that you have a clear and fair democracy? Okay, even if their side will have a democracy and they will establish a democracy on their side, why is it more probable that their democracy will not work? Stephen already said the argument that it's not self-determined. My extension is I'm going to analyze the state that these countries have in the current country. Okay, let's look at it, right? Because essentially you're having regional interventions and you're having your neighbors come in, what are the incentives that they have to make it stable? Two incentives. One is the economic state that they have in the country. Two is the political state. Peace and stability can come in many forms. It can come from a military junta who is oppressive, who gives people some food, but it can also come from a clean and fair democracy. Why is that dictatorship and military junta and abuses more probable on their side? One, obviously, proxies to the regions will come in from the neighbors from the different regions. Two, these proxies will take their own economic gain. Probably they're going to be elected by the people, probably they're going to be elected by the neighbors. What does this essentially mean? This essentially means that their actions, in that region, only take into account the mandate of the external sovereign nation. They do not take in the mandate of the internal sovereign nation. Okay, even if they'll have a democracy, we think that these democracies, the sectarian lines will come in. They're probably going to prop up, pro-Shia versus a pro-Sunni guy. Okay, go ahead.
We've told you that we're ensuring that there needs to be a quick mobilization and a return of basic infrastructure before you uphold the democracy. How do you think a democracy will be when they're extremely lacking in their most basic needs?
Again, investment will happen on both sides. It's not mutually exclusive. Let's go on to the argument. Let's continue the argument. What you're essentially proving is that the minimum rights will only be upheld. Why? Because examples like one, the Shah Pahlavi in Iran. Two, South Korea with Syngman Rhee. Three, Marcos in the Philippines. These are people that external forces like the US propped up. They provided stability, but they did not provide the will of the people. They did not care. What they're essentially doing is making it so that these people will only care for external sovereign forces. Okay, why is our side then comparatively better off? if we establish a democracy from the start, which is self-determined, self-established, and protected by the UN through monitoring for free and fair elections, other regions will have no incentive and no means to shut it down. 4 reasons. 1, they don't have instability, they don't want instability to transfer to the region. 2, the failed state had a legitimate election, so they have no excuse to put them down. 3, the international community will condemn them. And 4, they want good trade. So probably good trade will still happen. We'll have a state country. Their side isn't usually exclusive.
Thank you very much for that speech. I invite the government here.
The breach of sovereignty has only one question, which is legitimacy. We see that if a government doesn't anymore have the capability to fulfill the reason for having a sovereignty, which is protecting its people, then of course it is at the utmost right for us to have this policy and for this motion to pass. With this, we have 2 issues. First, how can we really rebuild the failed state? And secondly, can we trust the surrounding countries in governing these states for temporary, in a temporary time frame, right? So let's go then to the first one, on how we can rebuild these failed states. Because opposition's model is just this. You establish a democracy, and then somehow these investments would actually trickle to better infrastructure that is needed. Because as what our Prime Minister has already told you, these things, these infrastructures are what's necessary right now, and it is pretty much urgent. But we question their frame. How exactly can they use the aid and the investments that they have when they have a failed state? Because it just leaves us imagining the world. What really are the mechanisms? It really lacks on their side, and we see this goal of having rebuilding of the failed state is never going to happen in their side. Then they said this, that they should have the right to independence. But what's the use if they don't have the control, if they can't even do their responsibilities as a government? And then they said this, that we won't even leave them prematurely. But then we see that the question is thus then what this leaves us questioning what's going to happen, and also we see that it will still need the help of regional and neighboring states for help. So it concedes to a pragmatic, right? That these neighboring states are actually needed for rebuilding. But the question then thus becomes, do they really have an incentive to help? Well, we see that if you are neighboring states, you obviously have shared borders, and this is close proximities. Of course, you have an incentive for long-term preservation of your own state, and this is the greatest incentive for states to help. When terrorism, for example, or civil conflicts are actually trickling to the borders of your own state, of course, this is something that is necessary for you to intervene. And then they said, how can you expect them to actually help when they didn't really intervene to their path of becoming a failed state? But did they really make an ad hoc committee in those instances? We see that they didn't. The reason why they didn't intervene was because they were burdened by themselves. Because as themselves, they felt that individual states cannot just intervene. But our model calls for a coalition of collective action. And this burden, however big it is a shared burden, and enough to actually not individual states. Sure.
What you just proved was that regardless of an international trusteeship, these people will still invest because they have a stake in that country.
Maybe they'll invest, but you don't really have the capability to use those investments in the right way. At least with our trusteeship, when we get these investments, we will be able to have the right infrastructures that are needed to rebuild these failed states. Then, how are we actually winning this issue? Because government has already proved to you how the necessary facilities that are needed right now, that are needed urgently, can actually be accessible because of the close proximity and easy accessibility to resources, to facilities, to expertise, to the people that are needed to actually oversee and facilitate these types of rebuilding. Thus, then, this issue goes to government side. Second issue, on can we really trust the surrounding countries? Because they said that these surrounding countries may just give the bare minimum. But the government has already co-opted this by saying that these trusteeship councils are going to be overseen and guided the principles of the UN. The UN has the ability to actually post sanctions if need be, or post punishments if need be. So if these types of abuse happens, more likely they're not going to happen, right? So it's and then they said that why are we even going to give the power to govern? This is a question of this debate, but we see that the answer to this relies on what is needed by the failed state, what is needed right now. As we've already painted to you the urgency that we need, that these people in these failed states are suffering because they lack the basic necessities, such as like mere water, or the mere ability to have the housing that they need, or the mere education and the facilities that they need. In comparison to the alternatives of having the UN, for example, we know the UN having these investments come in, we see that this is something that is not going to be pragmatic. This is something that is not going to help this type of context and scenario right now. And then they made this big of an issue of the veto, which is a non-issue, because what we're just telling about vetoes is just it prevents the necessary action for the failed state's urgency. So if in a hypothetical scenario that Syria becomes a failed state, that Russia vetoes the types of help that is needed, it's something that is this is something that is really harmful for what these states need right now. Because with the question of sovereignty, as what I've already told you, we need to be able to protect these people. This is the priority of this debate, protecting the people and being able to give them the facilities and the needed investments and the ability for those investments to transform the facilities at the short term. And in the long term, we were able to prove to you how we were able to have the stabilization of the region and how it's actually an incentive for the regional or the surrounding countries to actually help. With this issue, we are very with these two issues that we are winning, we are very proud to take the challenge.
Thank you very much. I invite the opposition. Here.
Hello. Okay. So two issues in this debate. One about where we best in these failed states, and the second one about where these people were principally justified. Before I move on to those things, let me first hear about the previous speaker. Because what will ultimately cause them to use this debate is their failure to evolve their case and their failure to actually tackle part of the debate we brought up here. What did the previous speaker tell us? He said, one of the things she said was, how will you use A if it's a failed state? People cannot control the democracy if they're failed, right? We thought that came from their whim. That was a misrepresentation of our first speaker's case. We told you from the start, that we'll always be aim to let them be by themselves, we'll allow them to have like the democratic elections, we'll have the UN peacekeepers there, the UN forces, for example, to help them build their state, right? That's a misrepresentation that came even from the word, just showing how they weren't even involved in their responses. Right? Then he said, the UN also said, that the UN safeguards have to work on their side. But they didn't tell us. Why would the UN safeguards work on their side, but not work on our side? Right? Because we have the UN safeguards, those peacekeepers always make forces on our side also. Then she said, what is there, why don't people help on their side? Because they have shared borders, and thus it will help the nations around them. Firstly, no one said this in their entire batch. They just shared borders, only came from her. So what is that? New analysis. But secondly, it doesn't need to have, you don't need to have democracy or to fulfill human rights for this just shared border not to happen. All they have to do is make sure the violence is still over in their states. You're looking, for example, with oppression in their state, you're looking, for example, in another state, or for bad things in those states. That's why you have a previous speaker about you that they did not respond to. As long as it doesn't spill over, the shared borders thing doesn't actually work. So, before I go on to the issue, I'd like to point out why the first speaker, first of all, is value issue. Here are 3 quotes that came from. He said, states cannot provide services for individuals like police. Militia groups and terrorist groups grow in these failed states. And then on their side, they'll give the average quality of life and human rights. Notice, all the things that the first speaker said were arguments against failed states. We're not comparing failed people are saying failed people be alone, we're allowing them from democratic institutions. We're saying intervention on their side, but by the UN body rather than regional support. Right? So that's one of the first issue about our investor in failed states. So there are 2 big issues on this. One about speed, and the second one about the development of institutions like they talk about. This is now. So what is essentially do they say? Why do we win the institutions say? Because he said strong institutions can be built before things are fixed. But we tell you, strong institutions can happen on our side also. The previous speaker gave the analysis that they did not respond to. Once the democracy is built, the nations around you have lots of incentive to build those institutions, so your democracy doesn't mess up, and you don't go back to a failed state. But if you let the countries around you decide what kind of democracy you have, what kind of government you have, then that's something that won't beat the democracy or the building of institutions. They didn't give us any analysis why the nations around them want to build these institutions into being better for these countries. They found the analysis, but why it's more likely that dictatorships are things which aren't necessarily better because these states are incentives, right? So that's why we take the idea of institutions. But then we talk about like the thing about why it's always faster, and if it's faster, it's better, right? Why does this not make sense? The idea of things being faster and better is hard by the soft stats. On the first level, there's a contradiction in the onset. This is what the DLSZ is about. He said that the UN and EU developmental and humanitarian aid, right? But that has vetoes also. So if you're talking about our side is vetoes, then you'll have vetoes on our side. This developmental and humanitarian aid won't actually get the people who need it. But at the second level, on your side, if you're like votation and the countries around you, the most votation also slow things down because they will talk to each other about what both are going to be better off, right? He didn't give us any analysis why it be faster on their side. In fact, different countries are like have different and opposing interests, right? If you're a different country and I'm a different country, then we're like you're different industries and different things you want for this nation. This vocation is going to be like a modest nation, where everyone agree in the one thing. We're like the ulterior motives of these countries will go in and the nation will make things not a lot faster. Even if we get it, what else did they say? The second speaker said, we need stronger and faster actions, right? But then he also said, determine ulterior motives of countries and make sure they have none. Why do those two not work? Because they gotta take the time to determine which ones are ulterior motives, which ones are wrong space. How will they locate the experience or the history that they want on their side, right? You can't, because if you analyze each other around first, before you get to that'll take a long time. But we also tell you, how will you ever find a country that doesn't have ulterior motives? Always the country will want to fix their country more, or do things that will benefit your country, right? But we can do it better on our side. Because if those countries can have fast elections, for example, or those countries can make this really fast, then we tell you the UN can do these things fast as well. You can make fast democratic elections or fast institutions that are able to build there, right? They didn't give us any analysis about why it will be faster, why the countries are likely to work together. But even if we don't get faster, we tell you we get better on the long term. Because this is an analysis that our first speaker about you that they never analyzed, right? You need for the value of democracy to actually work. You need people to believe in democracy, to believe that it actually fights for them and that things are working out for them. If you have different institutions that is greater than democracy, even if they don't get the democracy in the long run, the rest of the democracy shove down their throats and not one that they're likely to accept. Is it that? Then they said, we cannot defend democracy on our side. We cannot give these secrets that we said we would, right? They didn't even tell us how they were able to defend democracy on their side, only you to defend things on their side, right? Is it that? Then the second speaker also said, they have free trade. That's a new problem for them. That we have no legitimate government. In fact, we have a better and more legitimate government on our side, given democratic elections. Why? Because democratic elections, we have a mandate of the people to the leader of that country. On their side, you have no legitimacy because you can never do that. Then he said, you have a cycle of violence and extremism, right? But you solve that through democracy. Why? When you feel oppressed or feel the followed, that's when they become violent and extremists on your side. On our side, you have democracy and you have armies to speak, armies to represent themselves, then they are not likely to become violent and extremists. We hear an example of the IRA, right? So why do you take the issue of what is better off for the country on our side? We told you lots of arguments that they didn't respond to. We told you arguments about proxy wars. Well, these are these ulterior motives that they want to put in there, and then we can't prove these ulterior motives. We told you about how long term, you need people to believe in democracy, you can only get that on our side. But on the second issue, why do we take this away principally? Why do we take this away principally? Because the only thing that they said, what did we give you? We told you that the states need to follow the will of the people, right? And that's the only thing that we have on our side that they were willing to respond to. Because they essentially didn't have a principle. And on your side, the definition of a failed state is, for example, not following the will of the people, right? So if the country is messed up, there's no legitimate government there, it is a failed state. But if it's on your side, you're allowing countries around it to convert that country, the country not have its own rulers, you're essentially replacing the failed state with another failed state. But rather that next failed state follows the interests of the countries around it rather than that country itself. All those reasons are about purpose.
Thank you. I invite the opposition to slide here.
From government side speeches, it seemed like they assumed that on our side we have to defend a failed state. We asked you the question, how is that even fair? Were you even listening to my model? Because I told you how on our side we're not defending a failed state, we're defending a post-failed state that is propped up through democracy. Because listen to my model. I told you very clearly how on our side we're perfectly fine with things like international aid, things like UN peacekeepers, to ensure that we're able to hold free and fair election for our side. And we're able to establish a fully established and fully legitimate government. They never responded to this. I believe five very clear reasons as to why government side will lose this debate. The first reason is very simple. They had an evolving model. The Prime Minister talked about how they'll have vetoes on their side, whereas DPM they won't have. Whereas PM talked about how they won't have vetoes on their side, DPM added that they are. So which is really next? The Prime Minister had no mention about how we would establish free trade agreements or things like the mobilization of workers. Whereas DPM said that they would, so they're adding problems to their model, which still shows us that they really didn't understand the burdens of this motion. Second, they contradicted themselves. Why? They told us that on our side, we don't have other international relations won't work because Russia will veto in the UNSC. But at the same time, they are relying on the same UN safeguards to safeguard against things like abuse under their side. To tell us the contribution, you can't have your AK and eat it too. Thirdly, we also say that their characterization is extremely convenient because coming from their DPM, we had this weird argument about extremism. Ladies and gentlemen, not all failed states are extreme. You have a spectrum of failed states, and that argument only works for a very small spectrum. Next, they assume that on our side, we won't have a legitimate government because their democracy is only established by a military, for example. But we tell you that assumes that the governments aren't free and fair. So that's a convenient characterization under your side. But fourthly, they didn't respond to our arguments because we think that we already told you extremely clear reason as to why regional states do not have an incentive to help out within these failed states. One, we talked about proxy wars. Two, we talked about greed. Three, we talked about regional power play. Fourth, we talked about why they only have an incentive to provide the bare minimum coming from the yellow. To this response, all government goods said, oh, you have shared borders. Ladies and gentlemen, just compare sophistication of analysis. That doesn't make sense. But then lastly, we also said that their analysis wasn't mutually exclusive. Because they talked about how on their side, government risk introduction is about why, we have the right to intervene because we don't have sovereignty. But then on our side, we're perfectly fine with re-establishing sovereignty as well. Next, they told us how on their side, their benefits aren't mutually exclusive as well. They talked about developmental aid, they talk about human rights issues. They talk about, for example, free trade. We told you when we can have those things as well on our side. Just because you have Propia, we also have Oppia on our side because we can do that through a strong, established democracy. Next, there are harms also more against because they talk about how on our side we won't have any agreement, but on your side you're also allowing people bickering in a conference room about what's the best way to go about this. And so on your side, you don't get agreement as well on your side. What was the mutually exclusive analysis we provided you on our side? First, we provided you with a principle of why exactly we need to hand sovereignty back to the state and why exactly it's so important for the appreciation of democracy in the long run. Second, we talked about why it's so important for us to have knowledge, to have these states govern themselves because they're the only ones that are accountable to their people. But thirdly, we also told you why it's important to have these states because they're the ones that know their states best. They know the problems within that state, and they're the ones that know how to support them. Ladies and gentlemen, this will be the first time for State of School to ever take the Asian Championship. Can we do it? Yes, we can.
Thank you very much. We hear for the very last time from the government that the grand finals of ASDC 2017 and why the government would like to well done.
Opposition side, we were never going to tell you that no, we don't want a democracy. This debate was about whether or not the way that you choose to establish that democracy is one that's adequate. Because on the first issue of which model is more effective, what was their model? They simply told us that, oh, we're going to establish democracy. Okay, how are you going to do it? Oh, we're going to establish democracy. Okay, we don't necessarily see what type of analysis that you had, other than telling us that when you establish democracy, these good things could happen. You never really established to us what happens when your peacekeepers, that was some hint of a policy or a counter policy that your side actually does these things. If your arguments were us to say that when you have a democracy, these things will automatically happen, what then happens on our side? The question then becomes, what then is the best way to establish this democracy? We gave you four amazing reasons why. This seemed to be very underappreciative or part of deputy, right? Where he gave us this brilliant point of analysis, where he told you that it's not just about where countries can veto and make decisions. It's also about things like, for example, quick mobilization. It's the mere fact that because you have shared borders, you can mobilize your troops, you can mobilize your workforce to be able to make sure that things, and you can react fast. He told you about proximity and likely to have shared interests. And they only chose to respond to me. I'm very flattered, but then what did I tell you, right? We told you that you're less likely to be put under foreign ground. But then even though I'm flattered, I say that the responses were inadequate. Why? Because they simply told us that, well, you're going to veto the aid. No, you can't veto the aid. That's not what happens, right? But rather, what happens then is that in this time, which is more likely to get vetoed? On the international playing field or that of a smaller committee, right? Okay, but then let's talk about their policy and how inadequate it really is to just say peacekeepers. Because what did they tell us? Because first of all, we established that, oh, this committee, this ad hoc committee is here to establish the basic grounds of democracy so that the basic infrastructure is returned and we could do something about it and make aid useful, right? What did they tell us? They told us that, oh, these peacekeepers are going to return basic infrastructure and then enforce policies to make sure that that basic infrastructure returns. So then, if they're okay with these peacekeepers enforcing these things from people that are thousands of miles away, why are they okay with people who are close to their proximity actually doing these things? So small bit of comparison. All they told us was that, oh, when you establish democracy, it's going to be good. How peacekeepers do that, we don't necessarily know. But however, we've told you that when you have an ad hoc committee of people closer to you, you can quickly mobilize, you're close, and you're less likely to be put under foreign drum. But let's talk about the principal issue that's very underappreciated, right? Principally, is it just to breach sovereignty? It was something that we've already pushed to them, and we've already talked about from the very get-go of the Prime Minister's speech, right? Because what did they tell us, and what was the exchange? Essentially, it was just, we talked to you about, is there really a state? In this instance, do we actually give you sovereignty? We told you no, because there's no capability to actually enforce this type of sovereignty, right? Okay, what did they say? Well, we like sovereignty. We like sovereignty, and therefore, we need to enforce sovereignty. And they just simply told us that, oh, if you have an election straight after, therefore, sovereignty is there, and that's something that we prioritize. Even if we consider that exchange is legitimate, the question then arises, and it's something that was talked about very thoroughly by the whip. We talked about which then we prioritize. And this is where the nuance of how you need quick action and quick mobilization occurs, right? Are we going to prioritize a democracy that's going to be built off of who can provide the most bread right now versus a democracy that has the basic infrastructure in mind, that has all of the comforts of a proper democracy to make sure that you can have a proper vote? The answer was simple, it's us. And the reason why that trophy isn't going to move and it's going to stay in Zubel is because with Raymond Chiuseco, we aim for victory.
Thank you very much for a fantastic